An email came through from Michael Christian of Edmonton, Alberta. It's rather a long comment that he makes, but I'll summarize it. Michael is approaching this looking for meaning in the icons. We talked about that last week. He said, in regards to Ezekiel chapter 1, I cannot see these living creatures as being anything other than cherubim. Ezekiel goes on to describe a similar experience at a later time in chapter 10:20. He states, and I knew they were cherubim. I think that's correct. I think that there's no real reason to look for anything else. He went on to say, with more than 90 Old Testament references to these creatures, it seems to me they are a real class of heavenly messengers. The Scriptures tell us they have direct access to God and His throne room and carry out a whole host of duties ranging from once guarding the tree of life in the Garden of Eden to, as in Genesis 3:24, to acting as the eyes of the Lord throughout the whole earth. I think it's important, Michael says, to note that God reveals to us that He dwells between cherubim in heaven, and moves on to the matter of icons, saying the meaning behind the four faces of the living creatures. Now, this is an interesting theory he advances here. I'll just pass it on. I think a case can be made, he says, that the four faces represent the 12 tribes of Israel, and here's why. In Numbers 2, we find out that during the 40-year period of sojourning through the desert, God arranged 4 camps comprised of 3 tribes per side of the tabernacle when they encamped around the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. There was a hollow square or circle was formed in the middle of the camp. Now, what he's saying here is not the least bit unreasonable. The division into 4 sets is there in the Exodus, not only in the camps of the Israelites, but the 4 sides of the heavenly city, which has 12 gates, 3 on each side in the book of Revelation. 4 and 3 are numbers of completion. 3 plus 4 is 7, and 7 in the Bible is the number of perfection. Michael goes on to say, after some poking around in history books and websites, I found that a number of Jewish sources believe that Judah's emblem was the lion. Who would dispute that, he says. Reuben's banner had the face of a man, Ephraim had the banner of an ox, and Dan the banner of an eagle. As the respective leaders of the brigades, their emblems took on the standard of that brigade, one on each side. These are, of course, somewhat speculative. There is no biblical evidence on them, but that's a pretty strong tradition going back, and you can easily see why Ezekiel, getting this, might himself say, oh, I see, that's Dan, and that's Judah, and so forth. One last thing. Michael goes on to say, God says He will again set up a banner for Israel when He gathers us back again. Maybe He'll start with Judah, who traditionally was the first to leave the camp on the Exodus mark. Not bad, Michael, and this may be part of the meaning of the icons. But be careful. You can hang your hat on something like this and come back and find your hat on the floor. It comes in the category of an inspirational theory. But God does do things like this. And it's possible that Ezekiel immediately saw what Michael had to dig for. At the end of chapter 1, after having described to us the living creatures and all the things going on with them, he saw, it says in verse 25 of chapter 1, there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads, that is, over the heads of the living creatures, as they stood with lowered wings. I gather from that they had flown in and landed and lowered their wings. Above the expanse over their heads, what looked like the throne of sapphire, and high above the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Oh, I can see the science fiction movie makers, making a lot out of that with all their special effects. He describes all that, and there's the voice that he now hears speaking is coming from one who has the likeness of the glory of Yahweh, or Jehovah in English. So what did the voice of the one like the figure of a man have to say to Ezekiel? Chapter 2. He said to me, Son of man, stand on your feet, and I'll talk to you. Now Ezekiel didn't say anything, but he might have been thinking, what? Me? Stand up? I can't even move. What do you mean, stand up? As he spoke, the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said, Son of man, I'm sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their fathers have been in revolt against me to this very day. It reminds me of that little thing in Fiddler on the Roof when the guy says, I know, Lord, that we are a chosen people. Could you choose someone else for a while? But the story of Israel has been one of a rebellious, hard-headed, stiff-necked, stubborn people from the beginning. And he says it's that way even now. And what's really interesting as we come along, we will begin to find that even in the Israelites who are in captivity, having their city devoured, having their city destroyed, having to walk all the way to Babylonia, having been humbled like they were, you would think, they are still a stubborn, stiff-necked people. He said, the people to whom I'm sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Jehovah says, and whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. You can see Ezekiel, his face is saying, Lord, they'll never believe me. And the answer comes back, so what? You tell them anyway. And the objective here is something that dawned on me a long time ago, and it's important to understand. If you know they're not going to listen, if you know what the outcome is going to be, why send them a prophet in the first place? Well, the reason for it is fairly simple and not that lacking in being obvious, is if you have been told ahead of time, clearly and distinctly by a prophet, when it happens, you will know it's of God. If you never send anybody to tell them in the first place, they might just say, oh, it's bad luck. No lesson to be learned from it. But the fact is, Israel had this whole lineup of prophets right from the very start of their problems, and they wouldn't listen to any of them. So, he says, I want you to go. You're going to talk to them. You, son of man, do not be afraid of them. Do not be afraid of their words. Don't be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of what they say or terrified by them, though they are a rebellious house. Now that is really striking. Briars and thorns and scorpions. Obviously, this is not literal. It's symbolic. But you can see them clearly in the Pharisees and Sadducees, who were murderers at heart. This is the kind of thing he means by these icons: thorns, briars, scorpions. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious. Now, this don't be afraid remark here is kind of interesting, because fear is an emotion, and you can't always control your feelings about things. And I can easily see how you go down, you start trying to talk to these people and explain to them what's coming down, and they resent it, they resist it. And in Jeremiah's case, you're arrested and thrown in the slammer. In another case, you're arrested and thrown in the cesspool, expecting to leave you there till you die. Not be afraid? That's easier said than done. I think what he means when he says, don't be afraid, is you conduct yourself as someone who is not afraid. Lift up your hands, strengthen your back. Come on, let's go straight on with this. Don't let them intimidate you. You may feel fear, but don't be intimidated. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen, whether they won't listen. But you, son of man, you listen to what I tell you. Do not rebel like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. And I looked. I saw a hand stretched out to me. In it was a scroll, which he unrolled before me. On both sides of it were written words of lament and mourning and woe. Now, the scroll, when you study your way through the Bible, you'll find it this way, is an icon of judgment that is impending. In Zechariah, we see a flying scroll, and you ask the question, flying? Why is it flying? Well, it probably means that judgment comes quickly. But you don't eat a scroll, do you? Well, not normally, so why? And Ezekiel's going to do it because he's told to do so. But what does it mean that he's asked to eat the thing? Well, this is chapter 2, and I'm going to leave you at the end of this chapter saying, what does this mean? Don't get lost in the literal. This requires a search for meaning. And when you think it over, I think you'll understand. In the last, couple or 3 decades, putting the IZE ending on a word has been a big thing, and one of the words that came out of it was internalize. We internalize things, make them a part of us. And I think that's what he meant by eat this scroll. He means internalize this message. And he starts chapter 3 by saying, Son of man, eat what you find, eat this roll, and go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat the roll. Now, I've had dreams like this, not of this, but like it, where you're asked to do something totally illogical. Something happens that's utterly meaningless. Well, it isn't meaningless. You just have to understand what it does mean. In this case, I want you to internalize this message, and then I want you to go and speak to people with it. Okay, cause your belly to eat, he said. Fill your internals with this roll I'm giving you. So I ate it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. Now, when you find out what's on this roll, you're going to think, what? I would have thought this was bitter. So what does it mean when he says it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness? Well, I'm not sure. But I think what he basically means is that God's judgment is fair and true and right. There's nothing wrong with the judgment. What's wrong is the house of Israel. So he said to me, Son of man, go get you to the house of Israel and speak with my words unto them. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a moment, take a moment to talk about the house of Israel. This is a political term, not an ethnic one. Think about it just for a moment. You'll understand what I'm driving at. Ethnic means that your dad was an Israelite or your great-granddad was an Israelite. And so it goes that ethnically, genetically, this has been passed down to me that I am an Israelite. When you start talking about the house of Israel, you are talking about the political structure of a nation. In other words, there is a body politic here in the United States. You're a part of it. It's a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, right here in the good old USA. We are the house of the USA. And perhaps for a period of time, we are the house of George Bush, but we were a house of Ronald Reagan, we were the house of Bill Clinton, and now, in a way, we are the house of Barack Obama. But it's a political term to call this the house of Israel. There had been a political division in Israel after the death of Solomon. There then were 2 political entities, 2 bodies politic. One was the house of Judah, which comprised Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. The other was the house of Israel, which took the remaining 12 tribes and formed them around the city of Samaria into the northern house of Israel. And so a person could be an Ephraimite, part of the house of Israel. A person could be a Benjamite, as Paul was, and part of the house of Judah. And that was a distinction that would have been drawn back in the days just following Solomon's death. After the destruction and captivity of the house of Israel and Samaria by the Assyrians, there was only one house left, and that was Judah. But then it is all that remains of Israel, and thus it tends to be spoken of as the house of Israel. As someone wrote to me and pointed out correctly, that the meaning of terms changes depending on the context. But there are going to appear some very strange references before we get through with Ezekiel. But the house of Judah went captive into Babylon, and the house of Judah returned. It began to carry the appellation house of Israel because it was all of Israel that was left. The house of Judah would have included settlers and later refugees from the 10 northern tribes. You know how this type of thing works. Some guy's doing business up in the north. His daughter married a Jewish girl. They got grandkids down there, so he decides, I'm going to move down to Judah. So I have no doubt there were Ephraimites or other tribes down there like Manasseh who were living in Judah when Israel fell. There may have been people who fled ahead of the Assyrians and settled down there as refugees. Paul, and we know he was Saul, but then became Paul in the New Testament, was a Benjamite who lived in Judah. He was a then Benjamite Jew, in the same way we have Italian Americans, which is a combination ethnic political identity. As an aside, Someone I heard in one of the colleges back east somewhere wanted to change Columbus Day to fall break, sort of like Easter was changed to spring break. Big problem with this is that that Columbus Day is one of the big Italian celebrations in this country, and they feel discriminated against. But back to Ezekiel. Verse 5, you are not sent to a people of a strange speech or a hard language. You're sent to the house of Israel, not to many people of strange speech or hard language whose words you can't understand. You know, if I had sent you to them, they would have listened to you. That seems to be the point of the book of Jonah. Jonah came through with a very simple message, and a whole nation repented. You take the same message to Israel, and Israel just looks at you like you're crazy, or worse. And Daniel, during this same period of time, seems to have had a profound effect on the king of Babylon, who almost seems to have come to a kind of conversion before it's over. He goes on to say, though, the house of Israel, they're not going to listen to you. Because, well, they won't listen to me. For all the house of Israel are impudent and hard-hearted. You begin to wonder, well, why in the world does God keep on messing with these people? Yeah, because of his word. That's the reason. But then he goes on to Ezekiel. I have made your face strong against their faces, your forehead strong against their foreheads. Like an adamant harder than flint have I made your forehead. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be dismayed at their looks, though they be a rebellious house. I guess this is a warning that anyone who sets out to preach in moral terms to a people like ours should take heed. I know I think about it often. I'm not encountering a lot of opposition, but I think that's only because I haven't been deemed big enough to worry about. That could change. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, all my words I shall speak to you. Receive in your heart and hear with your ears. That's the same as eating the scroll. And go and get you to them of the captivity to the children of your people, and speak to them and tell them, Thus saith the Lord God, whether they will hear or whether they will forbear. Now, this is interesting. He says, the children of my people. I take that to be an ethnic identity. I've noted this before elsewhere, that in prophecies that relate to the latter days, people are identified in several ways. They are identified ethnically, as in the children of, geographically, as in the land of Egypt will not escape, politically, as in the house of Judah, religiously, by the god or the demon that they serve. There may be others, but we need to think about them when we study prophecy so that we don't get confused about who God's talking about. Well, then the Spirit took me up, Ezekiel said, and I heard behind me a voice of great rumbling saying, Blessed be the glory of the Lord from his place. And I heard the noise of the wings of the living creatures that touched one another, and the noise of the wheels opposite them, and the noise of a great rumbling. The King James Version calls it rushing. The NIV, loud rumbling, and the root of the Hebrew being something like vibrations. So the Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit. But the hand of the Lord was strong upon me. Now, I take this to mean that Ezekiel was angry about this, about this time, for some reason. I don't know. It may be just the nature of the message, the warning that he'd been gotten, the fact that he knew clearly that the people of Israel were just exactly like God had said to them. Anyhow, he was in a very hot spirit when he came to them of the captivity of Tel Aviv. Interesting, Tel Aviv, or Tel Aviv, the name of the city in modern Israel today, was first apparently the name of a city in Babylon. It basically meant a green mound. To those of the captivity at Tel Aviv that dwell by the river of Kibar. And I sat where they sat, and I remained there astonished among them for 7 days. The Hebrew seems to mean I remained there stunned or devastated for 7 days. 7 days, he just sits there and doesn't say a word. He's just astonished. It came to pass, at the end of 7 days, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, I have made you a watchman to the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word at my mouth, and give them warning from me. When I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you don't give him a warning, and you don't speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. Now, I don't know how I can ignore this. I can look around me in society, and I can see plainly what is coming. Not from a vision, not from a dream, but from the prophets. It's just as clear as crystal. I can go back and read Deuteronomy 28, and all I got to do is read through it and look around me, and I say, I can see what's coming. And the prophets of old said, turn away from your wicked way or you're going to die. Now, if I have the opening and I don't speak, I'm guilty. And I have to own up to day after day that I have a platform that not everybody has. And so I feel a burden that the things that I'm seeing in prophecy, that I'm seeing in the news, I got to address, at least as long as I'm free to do it. Verse 19, he says, if you warn the wicked, and he doesn't turn from his wickedness or his wicked way, he will die in his iniquity, but at least you have delivered your soul. So I guess that's what I want. I want to deliver my own soul from the thing. I don't want to be guilty of somebody else's blood, so if God says tell him, all I can do is tell him. Don't get me wrong. Haven't had any visions. I haven't had any dreams. I just have got the word of God. And at Jeremiah, quoted God saying, he that has my word, let him speak my word faithfully. Again, verse 20. When a righteous man turns from his righteousness and commits iniquity, and I lay a stumbling block before him, he will die. Because you have not given him warning, he will die in his sin. His righteousness which he has done will not be remembered, and his blood I will require at your hand. Now, what do you think that means when I lay a stumbling block before him? Why would God do a thing like that? Why would God give us a cause for stumbling? Well, the thing about a stumbling block is that if your eyes are open, if you got a light to shine on the path ahead of you, you can see the thing and step over it. You may even be able to stand on it and see further. If your eyes are open and you know what to look for, and if you have a light. If you're drunk, it's dark, you're going to fall on your face and get hurt. Now, also notice about this. He didn't say if he would lay a stumbling block before him. He said when. What about you? You can count on the fact that the occasion for stumbling will be there. God says, I put it there. Well, by that, I don't know if he means he actually went and pressed a button on his console and put it there. He just says it's a part of the way we work here. You're going to have one in front of you. Will you see it, or will you ignore it? Remember the statement, your law is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. The law is the best light we've got in a dark place, and the whole idea is so we don't fall down and hurt ourselves. So here's your question. Is there a stumbling block in front of you in the path? Are you going to see it, or are you going to fall over it? Nevertheless, verse 21, he says, if you warn the righteous man that the righteous sin not, and he does not sin, why, he's going to live because he is warned. As for you, you have delivered your soul. Well, I think that's something all of us need to really keep firmly in mind. We have got a chance to speak to people. It may be parents, it may be children, who knows. But if we have the chance to warn people about a stumbling block that's in their way, we really have an obligation to do it. Then the hand of the Lord was there upon me, Ezekiel said, and he said to me, arise and go forth in the plain, and I will talk with you there. So I got up, I went out into the plain, and behold, the glory of the Lord stood there as the glory I saw by the river of Kibar. And I fell on my face. I don't think this falling is voluntary. In other words, he doesn't decide, this is God, I better get down on my face. I think it is something he couldn't even help. When you think about seeing a power like this, knowing who it is, and coming into the presence of more power than you've ever experienced in your life, a natural reaction to it is your knees turn to water. You can't anymore stand up than anything. And you wind up on your face. Continuing in the New International Version. He said, "You, Son of Man, they will tie with ropes. You will be bound so you cannot go out among the people." Sobering thing, isn't it? It happened to Jeremiah. They grabbed him, put ropes around him. They'd throw him in a dungeon. They threw him in the cesspool, the septic tank of the palace. And poor man, he had to go through a lot. And God says, "I will make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth so you'll be silent and unable to rebuke them, even though they are a rebellious house." In a way, this is what happened. That 7 days that Ezekiel sat there saying not a word. He was astonished. He was stunned. He couldn't speak even if he wanted to. Then God says, "But when I speak to you, I will open your mouth, and you will say to them, 'This is what the sovereign Jehovah says.' Whoever will listen, let him listen. Whoever will refuse, let him refuse, for they are a rebellious house." Boy, that just keeps being repeated and repeated and repeated. I can easily see how that would happen. I can see it today more clear than I might have 20 years ago. And it's not because I've gotten older. It's because society has changed in the past 20 years. 20 years ago, I could say just about anything. Today, I don't know that I can. I don't really expect the worst of this to happen within my years. But the moves taking place right now regarding hate crimes and hate speech could very easily lead to it in years to come. The one thing standing between us and that time is the Constitution. But for some people in leadership positions in our country, the Constitution is seen as an unnecessary obstacle to where they want to go. And right now, there is a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court of men who want to retain the Constitution. And when that majority is gone, I can't make any guarantees of where we're going to be after that. I can see, for a man doing what I can do today freely, I can see the man being in house arrest. I can see where God would make a man mute until the moment he wants him to speak. But you don't have to worry about this. There is nothing a person can do to make it happen or to prevent it. It will come about so that God can judge this rebellious house just like he did that rebellious house. And house is used in this sense for the body politic and the government. Now, this is history. It happened in a particular time and place, but don't think for a moment that you can just dismiss it because, oh, well, that happened back in the Old Testament. Human nature hasn't changed. And this is the most important thing. Neither has the divine nature changed. Isn't it strange that captivity would affect Daniel and Ezekiel one way and the general population a different way? Even captives, it seems, beaten down, humiliated, made to march hundreds of miles across the desert into captivity, can still be rebellious in spirit. I got an email from Mike in Boise, Idaho. He says, "Hello, I hope you are doing well." I am. Thank you very much. I finally caught up with you on the weekend Bible studies. I'm enjoying them very much. I was listening to one of your messages on the Christian holidays. In this message, you were talking about how it was 430 years after Abraham received his promise from God that the Israelites left Egypt. I know that after Abraham there was Isaac and then Jacob and finally Joseph came along. Due to the time required for each of these generations, wouldn't it have been a lot more than 430 years? Well, I can't really give you an answer to that. It's not something that I have thought was important enough for me to go back and work my way through it completely, but I have come across explanations and commentaries. And if you really want to study it, drop down by your library, look for some biblical commentaries, and look at some of the scriptures that make these statements. And maybe work your way back through it. There are different theories about how this 430 years works. He went to say, perhaps I'm confused about these time periods. Jacob was still alive when Joseph was in Egypt. To my understanding, there would only be a period of 30 years between Abraham and the beginning of the Jewish time in Egypt, and this could not be possibly long enough to have 2 generations after Abraham to produce Joseph, to give him time to grow up and be favored, to have the favor of Pharaoh, especially if the Jews had only been in Egypt for 400 years under oppression. Can you clear this up for me? No, I really can't, except for one thing, and that is that the 430 years is not going to the beginning of their time in Egypt. It's going to the end of it, to the Exodus, the time that they came out of Egypt. So, you can go back. There are, as I say, you'll encounter any number of theories and explanations, and different scholars will look at it different ways. It's my opinion that the 430 years to the very day was from the day Abraham entered covenant with God and got the promise. It was not from the end of his life. It was basically from that time. I think that the attempted sacrifice of Isaac was on that day, that is, on the particular day of the year, and that the self-same day of the year was the day that the Israelites came out 430 years after that. But whenever you start trying to work out chronology in the Bible, you are definitely on sandy soil, so be careful as you walk. Mike's second question is about the rapture of the church. I was curious about what you thought would be the reaction of all the people on earth at the time that did not go up to meet Christ. If they saw many of their friends and associates going to heaven, would it not convince them to repent, that Christ is the Son of God and the time of his judgment is at hand? I know in the Left Behind series, the people thought aliens had taken the Christians, not Christ. I didn't know that, by the way. I've never read any books. Anyway, it would sure seem to me that would make these people who did not get raptured very uncomfortable. What do you think? Well, the first thing I think is that the word rapture basically in the Greek comes from the Greek, which means a catching away. But also what I believe is that the time when that takes place is precisely at the return of Christ and the resurrection of the saints. If I read 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15 correctly, the rapture and the resurrection take place on the same day. Paul makes it very plain that we who are alive will not precede or not go to different time from the others, that we will all come together and go together to meet Christ, all the saints, living, dead, you name it. So this is, I think, important to understand. That event takes place at the 7th trumpet. Now, if you go back and you read through the 6 trumpets leading up to the 7th trumpet, you're going to see that people are going to be so preoccupied with the misery they're in and the danger they're in, they may not even notice the fact that a lot of people among them disappeared and got carried away. There's an awful lot of material on this. There's some denominations who believe firmly in what they call a pre-tribulation rapture, that people go into a place of safety. Actually, and some of them believe they are caught up into heaven to be with Christ before the Great Tribulation begins. Then the resurrection takes place at a later time. That theory is challenged by a lot of people in those denominations. All I can suggest is you use your Google trusty search engine and go looking up the rapture, and you'll find a lot more than you want to read. So what do I think? I think that everybody goes up at the same time, and the world will be in such turmoil and tumult that, as I said, a lot of people would not even know what has happened. We'll see. The time will be coming soon enough. Well, that's the Bible study today. That's all the questions I've got, and I don't think we have time to open up another chapter in the book of Ezekiel. So we'll talk again. Let me hear from you. You can write to me, Ron, at borntowin.net, and we'll do our best to get to your questions.